Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for Core 201. Today we're going to talk about Thomas Aquinas. So he was a Dominican priest, he was Italian, and basically he's like required reading. For anybody who wants to be a priest, if you end up going to seminary, you'll have to read him. And his whole deal was relating philosophy to religion. So he was kind of like a super fan of Aristotle, so you'll notice that that comes up a lot. And what we're reading is a piece from his like masterpiece works, Summa Theologica, and it's his effort to try to relate philosophy, religion, and ethics, and kind of like draw a through line that made sense. So he was trying to make a sort of logical sense out of his religion and prove that it was the best possible one. So, Thomas Aquinas was born in 1225 and lived until 1274, so he did not have a very long life, but he was prolific. He wrote so many books, books and books and books, and the one that we're reading is one of his like sort of masterpiece works. So he was especially famous for trying to like help educate little baby friars. He was a member of the Dominican order, so it's kind of a branch of Catholicism. So his special skills do include levitation, which is kind of dope, and chastity. So in addition to being a pretty clever philosopher, there's a lot of stories about him levitating, and so a lot of Catholic priests have these like legends about them, especially in regard to why they got sainted. And so one of his legends was that whenever he was like really full of the Spirit of God, he would straight up levitate off the ground. He was also so determined to be a Dominican friar that he like resisted his parents. So his parents were really wealthy, and for a little while after he decided to become a Dominican monk, they trapped him in a tower in his home castle, because of course he had a castle, because they wanted him to like be part of the family and have a bunch of babies and preserve their legacy. And Dominican friars are celibate. So they locked him in this tower to try to convince him to change his mind, but he wouldn't. So his brothers put a prostitute in the tower with him to try to like challenge his celibacy, and he chased her out with a fire poker, helped by angels, ? That part of the story comes later. So he was very devout with both his chastity and his levitation. In paintings of St. Aquinas, of which there are many, you'll probably notice a few repeating patterns, and this is pretty common, especially with religious iconography. So usually he's shown with a sort of sun at his chest, like a sunburst, and that's there to symbolize knowledge, and his desire to like have the knowledge burst out of him and be shared with other priests. And you may also notice his tonsure, which is what it's called when the monks have that haircut with the bald spot on top. And that was usually a sign of devotion, and it was given to like little baby monks, especially when they first started in the order. We don't really see that much anymore, but in most paintings, especially of medieval monks like he was, you will see both this haircut and a specific iconography for that saint themselves. So the piece that we're reading of his comes from the Summa Theologica, which is his masterpiece work. And it's big. It's like 3,000 pages, and we're only going to read a little bit. But one thing that's important to know about it was that he never finished writing it. So he'd been working on it for like 10 years, and it was a big summary of his theology. He did several summaries that were really big. But while he was writing it, he basically, in the middle of Mass one day, had what he called an extended ecstasy. Nobody's sure what that means, but basically after that he told them that he could not continue to write, and he couldn't dictate it anymore, and he wouldn't read it anymore, and he said that all of his words had turned to straw. So there's this kind of question of whether he had this epiphany, and maybe he realized that everything he had written was like garbage and it was wrong, or whether he had a stroke, and then it turned out that he couldn't understand what he had written afterwards. So he died pretty shortly after he finished writing this, so nobody's really sure what it would have said if he had continued to edit it. But basically what you need to know about the Summa Theologica is that it's required reading for priests. So if you go into the seminary, this is one of the things that you'll find yourself reading. And it's considered kind of law in Catholicism. Like one of the reasons that he's so revered is because this book is such a masterpiece. So we are just reading a few of the questions that are from the beginning of the second part, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about the structure. So if you look at the structure of the Summa Theologica, basically it is structured in the way that all medieval debates were done, which is kind of clever. So basically it starts with a question, and then the first answer refutes it. So basically you say, is this thing true? And the first part says, no, this is not true. And here's my first proof, and here's my second proof. Then you come back, And you say, ah, just kidding, it was true the whole time. And here is my rebuttal to the first proof, and here's my rebuttal to the second proof. And then there's a summation in which you prove how right you were. So essentially, it's a way of acknowledging the counter-argument. It's a way of saying, you might think that this thing is not true, but watch me prove it. So it's very confusing to read, but it does make sense if you think about it as the style of a debate. You might imagine it sort of happening out loud. So hopefully that helps. The other thing that I wanted to talk about before we get started with the questions was his definition of what a law is. And it's just so beautiful, and I love it so much. So it's kind of a complicated sentence, so we're going to go through and break it down piece by piece. So he says, it is an ordinance of reason. Okay, so first, an ordinance is basically any like official proclamation. It might be a law, it might be a decree, you know, it depends on what kind of civilization you're in. But basically, if you've ever heard someone say it is ordained, an ordinance. So it's an ordinance of reason. So that means that it has to spring from reason. It has to make sense. For the common good, so it has to be good for everybody, not just good for one person. Made by one who has care for the community. So this one is kind of two-sided. On the one hand, it has to be someone who cares what happens to the community. It can't be somebody who doesn't care. On the other hand, it has to be someone in a position of authority. So it can't be an authority who doesn't care about you, and it can't be somebody who cares but isn't an authority. It has to be both. So one who has care for the community and is promulgated. And I love the word promulgated. We don't use it much anymore, but it basically means made known. So you can't have a law that nobody knows about. You can't have a law that you like make at midnight and start enforcing at 12:01. You have to tell the people about the law for you to be able to enforce it. So again, this is a complicated definition, but it's all there. An ordinance, it's a rule that has reason, that makes sense. For the common good, makes sense for everybody. Made by one who has care for the community, said by a leader who makes good decisions, and is promulgated. So it's a gorgeous definition for what a law is, even though it's kind of a complicated sentence. Okay, so now we're going to get into question 90 on the essence of law, which sounds like a perfume commercial, but whatever. So here in this question, he's basically trying to figure out what is like the root nature of laws. What do we need to know that is at the very, very base of every law? So like all the other questions, it's broken into a couple of articles, which are the questions. So the first article, does law belong to reason? So this is a pretty good question. It's basically saying, do the laws all come from a source of human reason? Do the laws all make sense? Are they all based in something reasonable? And his answer, of course, yes. And he says, for it belongs to reason to order us to our end. And this should sound familiar, because when he says to order us to our end, he's talking about telos. So this is, again, very Aristotelian. He loves Aristotle. So basically, his telos is more heaven than, eudaimonia, but still, he's saying that basically reason is our telos, that reason is our sort of our reason for being. That's kind of a bad translation, but it's the thing that we depend on. It's the thing that we aim towards at all times. So for him, it's not so much happiness, it's more like reason, and that's how we get to heaven. So, does law belong to reason? Yes. The second article, is law always ordained for the common good? Yes. Again, this isn't an ideal situation. So are all laws always ordained for the common good? No. We'll talk about it, but no. But should they be? And again, his argument is yes. One example might be the laws that we've had recently in regard to the coronavirus and the way that we're trying to protect, everybody and not just some people. But another thing that's good about the answer to the second question is that there's a little shout out to Aristotle. So as part of noting that it's for the common good, he says, we call those laws just that constitute and preserve happiness and its particulars by citizens sharing in a political community. So again, this should look very familiar, but basically what he's saying is that the laws are just that create happiness. And not just happiness, but happiness for the community. So basically, when he's asking, are laws designed to help the common good, the answer is yes, because they should be based on the good for everybody. Again, very logical. The third article, is any person's reason competent to make law? I love this question. And he says no. He says no. He says basically any random human can't just make a law. Like you can't just stand up like this guy does and be like, new rule every time you make a show. You have to be a specific human and you have to have reason. So he says private persons cannot effectively induce others to virtue. So even if you are a really good person, you can't just like walk around with a cardboard sign, making up rules as you go. Only a person who makes laws, only a member of Congress in our case, can make laws. So any random person can't just like tell you what to do. Only the people who are in charge of making laws can make laws. So, is any person's reason competent to make law? No, only the people we elected. The fourth article, is promulgation an essential component of law? Yes. Okay, now to be fair, here he's asking questions that he wants to answer. It's kind of like a softball interview or something, but he has to answer these questions so that he can move forward. So even though he already said promulgation was essential, he's going to prove it. And in that regard, he says that essentially people can only follow the rules if they know what they are. So if you don't want dogs skateboarding in your park while smoking and drinking, you better tell the humans because the dogs can't read that sign. Or what if you're just a really cool dog with a skateboard and a cigar? If you didn't know you couldn't do that, it doesn't count. So if you want something to be illegal, you have to tell people that it's illegal. So, is promulgation essential? Yes. So question 92 is about the effects of law. So where we previously figured out what's at the root of laws, now we're wondering what happens when you have laws and enforce them. So the first article, is the effect of law to make human beings good? And he says yes. Again, this should sound very familiar because he says, habitual action causes acquired virtue. And where have we heard that before? Yes, that's right, from Aristotle. So again, he's leaning on the philosophers of the past, but sort of adding a religious layer on top. So the question is basically, if you have a good law, does that make the humans who follow it good? And again, we'll continue to debate this in class because it doesn't always work, does it? But in theory, yes. If your law is good, the people who follow it will be good. They will become virtuous by habituation. The second article gets a little more complicated. So this question is, do we suitably designate legal acts? And this question is essentially, have we been doing this correctly so far, and what are the effects of doing it correctly? So he says yes, he says we do suitably designate the acts, specifically by accomplishing these four things: commanding, forbidding, permitting, and punishing. So these are kind of like two sides of the same coin again. So I made a very beautiful infographic. Basically, any law has to either command something or forbid something. You can either do the thing or you cannot do the thing. And then it has to have an effect. It can either permit or punish. So you can do the thing or not do the thing for which you will be punished or rewarded. So essentially he's saying every law needs to say, do the thing and you'll get rewarded, or don't do the thing and you'll be punished, or do the thing and you'll be punished, don't do the thing and you'll be rewarded. Some combination has to be kind of reached in that regard. But basically, he's arguing that this is comprehensive, that all laws have to either say, do it, don't do it, and then good, bad. It gets much more complicated, but that's a very, very simple version of what he thinks the effects of laws will be. So question 95 is called On Human Law. So here he's trying to figure out how humans can make the best possible laws. He trusts God to make good laws, but what about humans? So the first article is, was it beneficial that human beings establish laws? What a question, right? And we'll get to this concept of like anarchy and what about humans just living in the wild. But he says, yes. Human beings, by nature, have a capacity for virtue, but they need to arrive at the very perfection of virtue by some training. This should sound familiar too, right? So essentially he's agreeing with Aristotle and saying, yes, humans need laws. He subscribes to that sort of tabula rasa as well, that humans are born like a blank slate, but they need training to be virtuous. So unusually, kind of, for a religious scholar, he doesn't believe that humans are born good or bad, but rather that humans have the capacity to be good or bad, and if you want them to be good, better give them some laws. That'll make them good. So the first article, was it beneficial? Yes. The second article, is every human law derived from natural law? And he says, yes. So let's back up and talk about what natural law is. So basically, his argument of natural law is that all humans are born with a sort of moral code, kind of like pre-installed by God. So essentially all humans have this like factory issued moral code, and that's what he calls natural law. So natural law for him is basically that the good is what all things seek. And again, for him it's religious, that the good is divinely inspired, that the good is directed by God. So for him, all humans seek the good, naturally. Number two, the good that we seek is a little bit different than other animals. So a human is going to seek a higher level of good than like a pig. So a pig might be chill, just kind of like rolling around in the mud all day, maybe doing some eating, but a human needs more. They have like a sense of virtue. They have a higher level of thought and virtue. The final part is that we seek the good because we are rational. So again, different from the pig who's just chilling in his mud pit, we are rational beings who can like think through our problems and think through what we want at the end of the day. So even though I have a lot of sympathy for the pig right now, basically he argues that humans are so rational that we're sort of operating on a different level than everybody else. So that's what natural law is. It's basically this like, again, factory installed moral code that causes us to seek the good at all times. So when he asks, let's go back, is every human law derived from natural law? The answer is yes. And again, he goes through the sort of complex system. So I've made another very beautiful infographic. But he says, laws have binding force insofar as they have justice. So your law is not binding if it is not just. We'll get to that in a second. And we say, regarding human affairs, that things are just because they are right according to the rule of reason. So justice itself springs from reason. But the primary rule of reason is the natural law. So, essentially, your laws are good because they're based on justice, which is good, because it was based on reason, which is good, because it was based on natural law, which is perfect. So hopefully that makes sense. And again, this is very idealized. This idea that all of our laws are based on some like inherent goodness and reason and justice is not always true. But we want it to be true. And again, that's one of the things that we're kind of talking about this semester, this idea that the rules that we use for social order are the rules that we make up. And we can change them if we want to. So looking at this sort of idealized system of rules and of laws is very important in that regard. They should be based on justice. They should be based on reason. And for Aquinas, this is how he explains it, that basically his God gave us those things. So the third article takes kind of a weird turn. The third article is, does Isidore appropriately describe the characteristics of positive law? The answer is yes, but let's talk about this guy, Isidore. So he was a Greek philosopher from the 1400s, and he's not particularly well known, but he was kind of a contemporary, especially for Aquinas, and so it's logical that he would reference him, even though we don't talk about Isidore very much. But we should, because basically his question is, did Isidore describe the point of laws effectively? And he decided yes, and he was correct. This is Isidore's definition, and it's complex and it's gorgeous. So he said, law should be virtuous, yep, just, yep, possible by nature, haven't mentioned that yet, but solid, in accord with a country's customs, also solid, suitable to the time and place, that's one of the ones we're working on, that's why we have amendments, necessary, amazing, we don't need a law if we don't need a law, useful, so clear that they contain nothing to obscure or cause deception, and decreed for the common benefit of all citizens, not the private benefit of some. It's so good. So this is, again, a guy we don't talk about very much, but this is a great definition. So the question was, did he appropriately describe the characteristics of positive law? And I'm agree, yeah. Yes, he did. Thank you, Isidore. Our next question, also about Isidore. Does Isidore appropriately designate kinds of human law? Also yes. So I'm going to show you a little bit of what he said about that. But basically, he said first it belongs to the nature of human laws that they be derived from the natural law. Yep, we agreed on that part already. Second, it belongs to the nature of human laws that they be ordained for the common good of a political community. Again, covered it. Third, it belongs to the nature of human laws that they be established by those who govern the political community. Fourth, it belongs to the nature of human laws that they direct human actions. So that part can be a little bit confusing, but this should sound familiar because this is basically the super simplified version, especially of Aquinas' version of what a law should be. So I know it's getting a little repetitive, but basically it should be derived from natural law, which again is like the code that God gave everybody. It should be for the common good. They're very serious about this. No law for one person. It should be established by the people who are in charge. Again, can't just be some random despot yelling out rules. It has to be the people that we designated to make the rules. And fourth, that it should direct human actions. That one gets confusing, but this goes back to the thing we talked about earlier, with it should either like direct the thing or not direct the thing, and then punish or not punish. So essentially the laws should make us into virtuous humans and citizens by habituation. So again, did Isidore do a good job with this? Yes. So in question 96, we start to get specific. So question 96 is about the power of human law. Essentially, how much power can we really give to human law, especially if it conflicts with religious law? So essentially, now that we know what laws are, now that we know where laws come from, what kind of power should they have? So, the first article. Should human laws be framed in particular rather than in general terms? Yes. Again, sometimes he just wanted to ask a question so that he could provide the answer, but in this case, he argues that laws need to be framed to suit things that more frequently happen, and laws are not framed to suit things that can happen once in a while. So essentially his argument was it would be a waste of time to write down a bunch of laws about like one random thing that happened one time, that instead the laws need to be general and not particular, that the laws need to be about stuff that happens all the time and not stuff that happened that one time. As an example, in Atlanta, I don't know if you knew this, but it is illegal to tie a giraffe to a telephone pole. Why? I don't know why. It must have happened one time and been a problem, so they made a whole law out of it, as though this were a thing that happens all the time to everybody. I love this law so much that last year for Halloween, I was a giraffe tied to a telephone pole. Super illegal, totally got arrested. No, I'm just kidding. But it is important to note that, yes, we have laws that are sometimes very stupid because they're directed at one specific thing, and maybe we don't really need a law for that. So what Aquinas was arguing is that our laws, if we're going to bother to write them down, should be kind of general and not like super specific. The next question is kind of the same thing, but in reverse. So the second article, does it belong to human laws to prohibit all vices? And here he says no, because again, it's the same thing, but in reverse. So similar to the way that we can't make a law for every little thing, we can't make a law that prohibits every little thing. It would be exhausting, it would be too complicated, and also we haven't thought of all those crimes yet. So essentially, we can't make a law about everything. An example might be that in Juneau, it's illegal to bring your flamingo into a barbershop. Again, they had to write that down because somebody did it. But the long quote that I want to show you that's more relevant to this is when he talks about prohibiting vice. So he says, and so, human law does not prohibit every kind of vice from which the virtuous abstain. Rather, human law prohibits only the more serious kinds of vice from which most persons can abstain, especially those vices that inflict harm on others, without the prohibition of which human society could not be preserved. So essentially he's saying that you do need laws to prohibit the big bad things, especially the big bad things that hurt other people. So does it need to be a law that, like, you can't smack yourself in the face? No. Is it a law that you can't smack other people in the face? Yes. So we can't outlaw every little thing because we gotta depend on humans to, like, do something. But we can outlaw the big things, especially the ones that inflict harm on innocent people. So that part's very important. So can we prohibit all vices? No. But we can prohibit some, and we can prohibit the big ones. So in the third article, we're back again on this question of how specific do we need to be. So he says, do human laws command every virtuous action? And the answer to this one is like, yeah-ish. Again, we can't get too specific. The rule book would just be so gigantic, and also there's stuff we haven't thought of yet. So he says, there are no virtues regarding whose actions laws could not command. So in theory, everything that is good we could make a law about, but Laws do not command regarding every action of every virtue. So are there laws that tell us how to behave? Yes, especially laws that are designed to make us virtuous, virtue by habituation. But there aren't laws for every single good thing. And also, sometimes he argues virtue doesn't need a law. So here are some examples. If somebody lets you out in traffic, it is generally known you give them thank you wave. Is there a law that says you have to do thank you wave? No. But if you don't do thank you wave, you're a bad person. Or is there a law that says that if someone is trailing a piece of toilet paper on their shoe, you should tell them? No. But you should. Everybody knows. That's just nice. Is there a law that says you have to help old ladies across the street? No. But you should. Is there a law that says that you have to give food away to the hungry? No. Again, it's kind of a religious expectation, but it isn't a law. So his argument here is that yes, we should make laws that help people be virtuous, but no, we shouldn't make every single virtuous action required by law. It would be too much, and also it would kind of defeat the purpose. The fourth article asks, does human law impose obligation on human beings in the court of conscience? I love this question because basically he's arguing that inside your head or your heart, there's a court of conscience that all of the time you are essentially arguing legal battles with yourself about what you should be doing. And he says that the laws should impose upon your conscience. That you, if you're trying to make a decision, should think to yourself, is this illegal? And if it's illegal, that should be part of your consideration. We'll talk about that more in a second, but here's the more extended quote that he talks about. If just, and again that means if the law is just, they indeed have obligatory force in the court of conscience from the eternal law from which they are derived. So essentially, if the law is just, and it is if they did a good job, if the law is just, it stems not just from reason and justice, but really from God, because it comes from the natural law. So he says essentially, if the law is good, and it should be, you should feel bad about breaking it. That you won't, like this guy says, be paranoid about breaking a law if you don't break the law. So your conscience should be clean. Your court of conscience should ease an easy ruling if the law itself is just. So essentially, you should feel bad if you break a law, if it's a good law. In the fifth article, is everyone subject to the law? So we're going to see this come back over and over, this question of are all men equal under the law? Is there any situation in which a person is not subject to the law? And he argues, yes, everyone is subject to the law. And he gets his definition for this, his sort of background justification for this from the Bible. So in Romans 13:1, it says, let every soul be subject to higher powers. So here, again, he's bringing a religious argument into a legal argument. So he's saying that since everyone is subject to religious laws, everyone is subject to human laws. So every soul is subject to higher powers, therefore every human is subject to higher laws. Are there some exceptions, you ask? Yes. There are lots of exceptions. And this is something that a lot of you brought up, especially in regard to the Constitution, because you really didn't like the idea that, for instance, senators who are traveling to Congress aren't subject to laws. And one of the ways that we're seeing this right now is a question of whether the president is subject to laws. So typically, a sitting president is not subject to certain laws, especially civil laws, and especially any laws that relate to the fact that he's in charge right then. So you kind of can't charge the president with a crime if the crime is part of his job. Or can you? So lately, this has been a real question because there are multiple federal courts trying to sue the acting president. And one of the things that they've decided is that he does not have presidential immunity for everything. So this is one of the things that we'll discuss, and we'll talk about some news stories about this because it's been really relevant. Is everyone subject to the law is a question we have to ask ourselves pretty much on a daily basis. The sixth article is the really crazy one. So this is one of the things that, again, I told you would come up over and over, but I bet you didn't expect to see it in Aquinas. So in the sixth article, are those subject to the law permitted to act contrary to the letter of the law? So you've probably heard this phrase before, the letter of the law. So the question is often the spirit of the law and the letter of the law. So the spirit of the law is kind of what he's talking about here. What did we mean when we made this law? The letter of the law is the super specific parts. So he says, yes, If the law is unjust, you don't have to follow it. He says, we ought pay more attention to the lawmaker's aim than to the very words of the law. So essentially, if you understand what the law is supposed to be about, you can break it if it's bad, or you can break it if the wording is dumb. So this is also something that comes up over and over. Like, here is an example of several different men that we consider to be excellent philosophers, from Thoreau to Jefferson to Dr. King to Gandhi. All of these men agreed that if the law is bad, you can break the law. Or if the law is written in kind of a dumb way, you can break the law. And then in fact, sometimes it is our moral obligation to break the law. So you have to remember that just because something is written down and is codified does not necessarily mean it's right. That's part of why we change our minds all the time. That's why we change our laws. That's why we change our social views. We have that option. If we wrote something down and we don't like it anymore, we can change it. Or if someone wrote something down and we don't agree with them and they're not in power anymore, we can change it. So remember this, because again, this will come up over and over. But the question is essentially, if the law is unjust, can you break it? And the answer is yes. So, on the subject of breaking laws and changing them, we get to question 97, which is about revision of law. So again, here Aquinas is acknowledging that sometimes the laws that we made are not going to be true forever, or we're not going to like them forever, or things might have changed dramatically. So he is setting up a situation in which you can change laws, and especially rules against changing them too often and changing them for bad reasons. So, the first article. Should human law be revised in any way? Yes. So he kind of leaped straight into that one. That one's a pretty easily answered one. And this is, again, something that we're thinking about a lot, especially in modern times, especially, again, on a daily basis. Sometimes we have a law, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't ever change it. So the first question is out of the way. Should human law be revised? Yes. However, the second article says, should human laws always be revised for something better? And this is a really key question, because he's saying, yeah, we can change the laws, but not all the time. We don't want to just change the laws every day or every year or something like that. And we don't want to change the laws just to change them. So should human laws be revised? Not all the time, only if it's going to be an improvement. And this is a hard one. But this is why it's so hard to change the Constitution, for instance, in America. This is why you have to have a supermajority to change a lot of our laws. This is why you have to have a supermajority to change any amendments. Because basically, we don't want to risk revising things when they didn't need revision. So the long quote on this one, the binding force of the law is diminished when laws are revised, since custom is removed. So essentially, if we are used to a law, and then it changes and changes and changes and changes, it kind of doesn't have as much power anymore, because we're all like, yeah, what even is the law? Like, I knew the law yesterday, but now it's a different thing. Like, if you've ever worked for like a really bad manager who changes the rules all the time, it's frustrating, because you can't keep track of what you're supposed to be doing. So he says, yeah, you can change them, but don't change them too much, because then they lose their power. Then you're just like, oh, who even knows what the law is? It's probably different tomorrow, and people won't follow it. So he says, and so, human laws should never be revised unless the Commonwealth gains in one respect as much as it loses in another. So don't just change your laws all willy-nilly. Make sure that you're gaining more than you're losing. So you should only change the laws if you have a good reason and you think the ultimate outcome will be better than the law itself. The third article is about whether something that we didn't put into law, but something that we do all the time, can kind of become like a law. So it's essentially arguing that something that is customary might seem like a law because we're just so used to it. So the question is, can customs obtain the force of law? And the answer is yes. Essentially, if we do something over and over, it's basically a law. So he says, for things done repeatedly seem to proceed from deliberate judgments of reason. And so, custom has both the force of law and abolishes law and interprets law. So if we do something often enough, it must be because it was a good idea. It must be from the force of reason. So essentially, the custom of the people in the place at the time can kind of become like a law. So one example is tipping. You are not legally required to tip, although again, if you don't, you're a bad person and you shouldn't eat out. But you're not required legally to tip. But it's become so customary that everybody does it. again, except for bad people. But the idea is, we started doing this, we're so used to doing this, it might as well be a law because everybody does it. So can customs obtain the force of law? Yes, because we are creatures of habit and we are social creatures, and if everybody else is doing it and they've always done it, we'll probably do it too. So, the fourth article. Can the people's rulers dispense subjects from human laws? Very tricky. So the question here is, can a ruler decide that a law is not specific to a person? So essentially, like if a child commits murder, we don't put the child in jail because we assume that they didn't mean to. So you can make exceptions. So essentially the question is, can the ruler decide that this person is an exception? And his argument, again, is yes, but you got to be careful. And a precept generally, for the convenience of the community, may sometimes be unsuitable for a particular person or in a particular case. So even though you made a law that generally is good for everybody, there might be a case in which it's not. So you might have seen people, for instance, plead not guilty by reason of insanity. That's kind of an example of this. You know, we don't charge minors, we don't charge people who are mentally ill, we don't charge people who are already dead. Essentially the question is, can you make exceptions? And my favorite example is coming up soon, which is that we have this tradition in which the president pardons a turkey. Why? Nobody knows, like it's just kind of cute and telegenic, but it's an example of the leader can make an exception in one case. So is every other turkey going to die at Thanksgiving? Yes, but not these turkeys. I encourage you to watch it this Thanksgiving, it's always funny. So, those were a lot of complex thoughts, and trust me, we'll dig into them pretty hard in discussion, but the things that I want you to keep in mind for your Constitution are these thoughts about laws. So for instance, are you going to have a religious base for your laws? You can, if you want. Are you going to outlaw a lot of things? Are you going to make it compulsory to do a lot of things? You could. Again, you can't make everything legal or illegal, but you could do some stuff. Are you going to let your laws be changed? Again, you have the option of being full evil, so you could make it so your Constitution can't be changed. But I think he makes a pretty good case for why you might want to change it. So you might want to put rules in place for how to change it and when and by whom. And of course, are you going to promote virtue or vice? So I'll see you soon, and we'll have a lot of talk about laws.